All right, so we are recording now. So what is the Adirondack Park Invasive Plant Program? APIPP has been around since 1998. Our founding partners are the Nature Conservancy, the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, Adirondack Park Agency, and the Department of Transportation. We are housed inside of the Nature Conservancy and funded by the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation. And we work closely with these 4 partners, as well as, I would say, at least 30, 40 different partners throughout Adirondack Park, from lake associations to individual municipalities and towns to schools and nonprofits. We work with everybody who is interested in preventing the spread of invasive species. We are one of 8 different PRISMs, or a Partnership for Regional Invasive Species Management, across the state. Our partners in the St. Lawrence, Lake Ontario region are also, or SLELO for short, are also housed within the Nature Conservancy. And there might be a different PRISM partner in your region if you're not calling in from the Adirondack region. So we work with the Blue Line up to Lake Champlain and up to the Canadian border. So you don't necessarily have to be within the Blue Line to work with APIPP. And we're able to connect you with different PRISM partners throughout the state. So if you're calling in from Long Island or the Hudson Valley, the spread of invasive species doesn't necessarily respect these, man-made boundaries. So we're here to work with our partners, you, and connect everybody in terms of education outreach to prevent the spread. Oh, I'm sorry. I skipped over our wonderful speakers for today. I got distracted by the recording. Zoom is all still so new for teaching. So we're going to hear a little bit from me for this intro part, but we're going to mostly hear from our excellent Becca Bernacki, our terrestrial invasive species coordinator. Her email is here, and I will share that out with you all. And then if you've worked with APIPP for quite some bit, or even before this year, you might know Zach Simek. He is actually moving on from the position of terrestrial invasive species project coordinator to conservation and GIS analyst. And his email is also here, and we'll share this out as a follow-up. Oh. Hey, Zach, while I'm giving this talk, would you mind just admitting people to the room if they're in the waiting room? Or Becca, if you get to it before me as my co-hosts. So now that I've introduced Becca, I am going to let her take it away and go over part 2 of what are invasive species, why do they matter to transportation professionals, and then we'll jump into species identification.
So hello, folks, and welcome. I'm going to jump in by talking about what are invasive species. You'll probably hear me noting to Emily to advance the slide. She is our slide master for the day. So if Emily, you could advance the slide, that'd be amazing. So what are invasive species? Invasive species are typically thought of as non-native species that grow rapidly, forming dense stands, and can negatively impact the environment, the economy, or human health. So if you look at the right of this slide, we'll see a couple examples of that. So at the very top, we have an individual who was burned by the sap of giant hogweed, and you can see how invasive species can impact human health. In the middle there, we have some Japanese knotweed that's growing up through some asphalt. That would be a negative impact to the economy. Obviously, there's going to need to be some road work done to fix that. At the bottom, you can see some Phragmites that has grown in a very dense stand, and it's so dense that none of the native species can grow there, damaging the environment. Slide, please. So why should we care about invasive species? Number one thing that comes to mind for me is that these invasive species tend to form monocultures. And a monoculture is just an area where one species is very, very dense and excludes all other species, so only that species is present. This is a problem because it leads to habitat loss for wildlife. It's also not very fun and not very pretty to look at. When you go visit your favorite wetland or your favorite forest, you like that diversity to look at. So there's lost recreation and property values associated with invasive species. We also talked a little bit about human harm. that can happen as a result of invasive species. We talked about that toxic sap that's associated with giant hogweed and wild parsnip. And there we can also see increases in ticks and tick-borne diseases as a result of invasive species. Some of these very dense stands tend to, attract mice and other small mammals that carry ticks. Slide, please. So what are the impacts to infrastructure, and why should you folks as transportation professionals really care about this, and how does it impact you? Slide, please. The number one thing to think about is these species are super fast growing, and they can quickly overtake your right-of-ways. And a lot of times this means that they outpace your maintenance routines, your resources, and your time. You don't want to be having to go back and mow several times a year just because these species are popping up and causing problems. Slide, please. So more specifically, we can think about blocked lines of sight, around corners and stop signs, and also block signs. As you can see in this picture here, we have some Japanese knotweed kind of blocking that curve and speed recommendation sign. Slide, please. They can also overgrow guardrails, creating issues there, and block drainage. You can only imagine a species this dense growing, around a culvert. It's going to create some drainage problems. Slide, please. And a lot of these species are really persistent, and they'll take advantage of any small crack or hole in asphalt or concrete, and they'll just, grow and create further buckles in that infrastructure. So one of the big issues is these invasive species really damage the infrastructure and cause problems that way. Slide, please. So how are invasive species spread through road work? Let's get into that a bit. Slide. So one of the number one things that comes to mind for me when I think about invasive species along the right-of-way is mowing. When you folks are out there mowing, obviously you're breaking apart this plant material, and you can only imagine, think about a dandelion. You mow a dandelion, those seeds go everywhere. And that doesn't happen for just that dandelion, that happens for any species that's in seed at the time of mowing. So not only are you spreading that seed, kind of locally, if you get that seed material or that plant material on your mower deck or on your equipment, and then you move that equipment, 50 miles down the road to the next site, you're spreading those seeds that way as well. Slide. Invasive species are also spread through soil disturbance, and there's kind of two vectors that come to mind for me for how this happens. The first is you're exposing bare soil, so you're exposing seeds that were in the seed bank that hadn't germinated and grew in a while, and that can lead to spread. You're also disturbing that site. So say you're digging a ditch like the folks are here, you're exposing soil, so you're moving away whatever species that were growing there, and the invasive species tend to be rapid colonizers, so they might be able to get on that bare soil and grow a lot quicker and a lot more readily than our native species. Slide. And the third way we think of invasive species being spread in transportation is the movement of contaminated fill. If you buy fill from an aggregate supplier and they have Phragmites growing in their fill pile, and then you move that fill to your site, you're spreading that species with it. Slide. So let's get into some of our key species that you folks should be on the lookout for, and let's get to know them a bit better. Slide. The 4 species that we're going to talk about here are knotweed species, Phragmites or common reedgrass, wild parsnip, and the swallow-wort species. Slide. So our first kind of suite of species we're going to look at here are the knotweed species. We have 3 species of knotweed that grow in the Adirondack region: Japanese knotweed, giant knotweed, and a cross of the two, which is known as Bohemian knotweed. They're all pretty similar with respect to how you ID them, so we're going to kind of handle them in a bunch here. So giant knotweed, or Japanese knotweed, are all shrubs, and they grow very tall, and they may exceed 12 feet in height. So if you look at the gentleman here, obviously that knotweed is much taller than he is. Slide. So looking at the knotweed leaves, as you can see here, is that they are typically heart-shaped. So they come to a point at the top, and where they attach to the stem usually has, you know, either a small indentation or pretty flat at the bottom. These leaves are alternate on the stem. So you can see that the leaves are not directly across from each other. They kind of zigzag up the stem. Thanks, Emily. And these leaves are typically at least 6 inches long. So they're pretty sizable leaves. Next slide, please. Kind of the biggest identifier of knotweed when we get phone calls from folks asking, what's this thing growing in my yard, is they call it bamboo. You know, what's this bamboo in my yard? When you see knotweed, it looks a lot like bamboo. It's a hollow stem, which is light green, and there is a ridge or a node. If Emily could kind of move her cursor over one of those guys, every 4 to 6 inches. Slide, please. So knotweed also flowers, and its flowers are in bloom from August to September. And its flowers are kind of a wispy, large cluster of white small flowers that occur at the end of the branches. Slide, please. So how is knotweed spread? So knotweed spreads through expansion of its extensive underground root system. It does spread a little bit by seeds, but mostly it's through the growth of its roots. What's really important for you folks to know is that knotweed can also be spread by fragmentation of its roots or its above ground stems. So if the species is broken up and those pieces are laying on the ground, those little fragments can reroot out and, you know, kind of spread the expansion. So if you're mowing along a right of way and you hit some knotweed and it all gets broken up into chunks, you might have started with, you know, say a small infestation of 5 individuals, and then you end up with 500 because each of those fragments became its own knotweed individual. Next slide, please, Emily. So our next species is common reedgrass. We commonly call this Phragmites. You'll probably hear me refer to it as Phragmites throughout the rest of this presentation. Phragmites is a perennial grass, and it can range in height from 3 to 5 feet. It's generally pretty tall. You generally see it in kind of damper areas along the roadside. Next slide, please, Emily.
Becca, I'm going to pause you for just a second so I can get our chat box off of the screen I'm sharing. Zoom is preventing me from grabbing that for a second.
No problem.
Okay. All right. Please go ahead.
Okay.
Thank you.
No problem. So let's talk a little bit about identifying Phragmites. So kind of the number one thing I look for is that height. You know, we talked about it being very, very tall and usually in dense stands. Another thing I look for, especially as we get into summer, is that large, feathery, sort of purpley plume that it gets on the top of the individual reeds. And those flowers generally change from purple, brown to tan gray as the season moves along. You can see that on the right side of the screen. On the left side of the screen, we have what is known as the ligule. And the ligule is where the leaf attaches to the stem. And kind of the defining characteristic of Phragmites, if you're out in the field looking for it, is that ligule is pretty hairy. So you can see that tuft of white hair on that ligule in the picture on the left. Next slide, please. So much like knotweed, Phragmites is also spread by expansion of its extensive root system. It can also be spread by fragmentation, just like knotweed, and also its airborne seeds. And here we have a very, very dense stand of Phragmites growing across the wetlands. Next slide, please. Let's get into wild parsnip. The wild parsnip is another common roadside plant, and we wanted to make you guys aware of this one because this plant contains a phytotoxic sap that can cause chemical burns when you get that sap on your skin and that skin's exposed to the sunlight. If you were unlucky enough to forbid get it in your eyes, it could cause permanent blindness. And then when you get it on your skin, it will cause a chemical burn, which will blister, and you'll have, the side effects of that. Wild parsnip is a perennial herb, and it grows to be fairly tall, about 4 to 6 feet tall. And it's got this nice yellow flower, which we'll talk about in a bit here. Next slide, Emily. The leaves of wild parsnip are pretty identifiable. So they're compound leaves, which means that on the stem there are multiple leaflets. So the common thing I tell people to think of here is a simple leaf would be something like a maple leaf, where a compound leaf would be what you would see on like an ash tree or a walnut tree. These leaves are very sawtoothed. You can see just how jagged that those leaves are, and they're typically arranged on pairs on the stem. So you can see that they're kind of directly across from each other on that stem. Next slide, please. So as far as the stem is concerned, wild parsnip has a branched stem. You can kind of see how it breaks out at the top there into multiple stems. The stem is hollow, and does contain that phytotoxic sap. The stem is slightly grooved, so if Emily can move her cursor, you can kind of see some slight grooves, on the front of that stem. Next slide, please. So the flower, like I said, is pretty unique. So wild parsnip has what is known as an umbel, which is a flower cluster. So you can see that, there are multiple little flowers that make up one big flower. And these flower clusters tend to be 2 to 6 inches wide. And the individual small flowers have 5 yellow petals. This is in bloom right now. As you drive along, I'm sure you'll see it along the roadside, and it blooms from June until late August. Next slide.
I was just going to add, Becca, that thinking of these flowers, there's a few other plants that are shaped like this in bloom right now too, that are a lot lower growing. Like Queen Anne's lace is a common weed you see. But one thing to remember about the flower is that the word umbel comes from, it's the same root as umbrella. So it's like an upside down umbrella, or the inside of an umbrella. So if it's quite tall and has these leaves that Becca was just mentioning, it's a good idea, even if it's not wild parsnip, to just figure out what it is so that you can prevent any harm to your skin.
Yeah, Emily, thanks for sharing that. I actually didn't know that umbel came from umbrella, so thanks for sharing.
Umbrella, Ella, Ella, A. Right.
So wild parsnip, unlike our other species, is not spread by fragmentation. It is spread by these small seeds. And these seeds are small, broad, and they are slightly ribbed. So you can kind of see there's slight ribbing, kind of like 3 veins in there. You can see those black little veins Emily is highlighting for us. And as you can see, there's lots of seeds associated with this, one individual of this species. So it spreads pretty rapidly once you get it in one area. Next slide, please. The last species that we're going to talk about today are the swallow-wort species, and much like giant knotweed, these are tightly grouped. They're in the same species group. The 2 species that we have here in the Adirondacks are black swallow-wort and pale swallow-wort, and they're pretty similar with everything identification-wise, except for their flowers, and we'll talk about that difference when we get there. This species is a perennial vine. You can see kind of it grew over everything in the foreground of this picture here, and kind of took over. Next slide, please. So swallow-wort's leaves are pretty unique. They stand out pretty well when you're walking around and see them, because they're this deep glossy green. There aren't a lot of other species out there that are this deep glossy green. And these leaves are opposite on the stem. So as you can see here, they're directly across from each other when you look at the stem. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned earlier, the difference between these two individual species are the flowers. What the flowers do have in common is that they're both very small. You can think of them as dime size, and they both bloom from late May until late July. So on the left, we have what's known as black swallow-wort. So obviously it has that nice purpley black color. And the petals here are about as long as they are wide at the base. So you can see the flower petals are a little bit wider there. On the right-hand side, we have what is known as pale swallow-wort. And pale swallow-wort is this kind of pale pinky color. And its petals are about twice as long as they are wide at the base. So its individual petals are a little bit skinnier. So in addition to the obvious different color of these two species, you can look at the relationship between the base of the petal and its length. Next slide, please. So swallow-wort also has these fairly unique seed pods. They are smooth, slender pods, and they're abundant in late summer. We've actually started seeing them on some swallow-worts already. They kind of remind me of milkweed, which we'll get into in a second. And these seed pods will split open, releasing a downy seed, much like you would see coming from the milkweed species. Next slide, please. So the seeds here are dispersed by the wind. Obviously, you know, anything you see out there that's got that white wispy or, you know, floaty kind of seed is wind dispersed, and so it can spread quite a distance, you know, since it's spread via the wind, and it resprouts vigorously, you know, when those seeds are spread. Excuse me. An interesting thing kind of to note is that black swallow-wort is not widespread in the Adirondacks. So it's one of our early detection species. There's only a few occurrences that we know about it. So if you were to see it, it would be great if you could reach out and let us know where it is, and we could get a crew out there to take a survey of it. Kind of another interesting note about the swallow-wort are that monarch butterflies will lay their eggs on the swallow-worts, mistaking it for common milkweed. But the larvae will unfortunately not survive because they're unable to eat the leaves. So these swallow-worts not only are bad because they're overtaking our, you know, areas and outcompeting native species, they're also bad for our monarchs, which we've been trying to bring back. Next slide, please. Now I'm going to pass the baton to Zach at this point. Thanks, folks.
We'll probably have some questions about identification and species, and so please pop them into the chat and I'll facilitate those for later towards Becca. All right, I'm going to share with you, Zach.
Thanks, Emily Bell. Good morning, everyone. This is Zach Simic with APIPP. And for part 5 of our presentation, we're going to transition into talking about some prevention activities and the best management practices that you can use to help limit the introduction and spread of terrestrial invasive species along transportation corridors. And right on cue, my dog is going to start barking in the background. So a lot of the information that I'm going to share today, it is distilled down. As Emily Bell mentioned, this is usually a 3-hour workshop. So we're going to keep things pretty high level, but we're going to share some recommendations that are primarily drawn from the manual featured on your screen. This is Best Management Practices for Roadside Invasive Plants, and it is a DOT document that has been developed in collaboration with APIPP and other partners. So we know that prevention is key to addressing invasive species. It is the most cost-effective means to address invasive plants. Once they do become established along the right-of-way, they become progressively more costly to address, and our chances for successfully controlling them decrease over time. So we're going to talk about BMPs really in 5 kind of arenas. We'll begin talking about soil disturbance and stabilization. We'll discuss some equipment movement and maintenance, mowing, plant disposal, and finally some ditching and excavation BMPs. So first we'll discuss soil disturbance and stabilization. So why is this a problem? We know that when areas are disturbed and bare soil is exposed, it makes that location more vulnerable to the introduction of invasive plants. Having bare soil at a site increases the likelihood that invasive plant seeds can successfully germinate and begin to grow. And kind of on that same note, we know that where we have a nice, well-established layer of vegetation, invasive species are less likely to become established. So what can we do about soil disturbance? First and foremost, we can limit our disturbance whenever possible. Consider if this activity is necessary and use the appropriate tools. We don't need a sledgehammer to drive in a finish nail, so we don't need an excavator to move a 5-gallon pail of soil. So using appropriate equipment to limit disturbance. And if we can't avoid a disturbance, being mindful about what we do following those activities. So we know that disturbance and earth moving is part and parcel of highway construction and maintenance. So when these activities are conducted, it's important to stabilize soils as soon as possible following the completion of those activities by doing things like seeding with native or at least non-invasive sources, or using a straw mulch. This can help establish a layer of vegetation at the site to prevent or minimize the likelihood for invasive species of becoming established. It is also a good practice to continually monitor these sites for a few years post-construction to help keep an eye on the site and determine if there are any invasive plants emerging. The faster that we can address them if they do emerge, the greater the likelihood that we can successfully control them. For large projects that we know that are coming down the pike, where we know soil disturbance will occur, if we have advanced notice or planning for those projects, it is a good practice to do some pre-construction screening, determine if we currently have any invasive plants on site, and if so, work to address them before the soil disturbance occurs. And if introducing any type of fill to address these disturbance activities, screen that to ensure it is free of invasive plants, plant parts and seeds. Next, we'll talk equipment moving and maintenance, and this is something that Becca kind of alluded to in her overview of how invasive species can be spread along transportation corridors. So we know that seeds, plant fragments, contaminated soil can all be caught up in equipment, everything from big excavators to just a simple shovel. If there are plant parts or seeds on that equipment and it's moved from one place to another, those pesky species can hitchhike along and become established in new areas. So what can we do? When possible, we can avoid work in areas containing invasive plants. We know that that's not always possible, so if it must occur, we can work from uninvaded to invaded areas first. We don't want to start our day working where there is abundant knotweed or loosestrife or phragmites, and then later on move to an area that's free of those plants, because it's likely that we would be introducing those to that area. When staging, loading, unloading, or storing equipment, do so in an area that's free of invasive plants. If we're unloading a piece of equipment right into an infestation of phragmites or wild parsnip, we're that much more likely to pick up seeds or plant parts on those equipment. And then one of the simplest things, and perhaps most effective, that we can do is just clean our equipment after use. This could be as simple as using a stiff bristle brush to remove any visible plant parts, seeds, or mud while in the field, or taking the extra steps to do a portable wash on site or upon returning to a highway residency. Cleaning equipment is especially important when moving significant distances between regions or towns. So for some of our state partners that are on the call, we know that your regions span our boundaries of the Adirondack Park, where maybe one day you're working south of the border in Alder Creek, and the next day you'll be moving across the blue line into Old Forge. So in cases like that, you're moving from an area with a lot of invasive species to an area with fewer, and taking the time to clean the equipment before going between those regions is critical. Next, we'll talk about mowing. Becca mentioned how certain species can be spread through mowing activities. So something like knotweed that we know spreads by fragmentation of its stems. If we bring a mower through this infestation, we may be controlling it in the very short term, but long term we're spreading fragments down the road that is just going to increase the size of this infestation. And similarly, for species that are dispersed by seed, if we're mowing them at the inappropriate time of the year while they are while they have fully developed seeds present, it's likely that those species could be distributed down the right of way. So what can we do? First, consider if mowing is necessary. Is this mowing activity truly a safety or a maintenance need? Or are we just mowing this area because maybe it's just something we've done for a long time in the past? The highway right-of-way and shoulder doesn't need to look like the 7th fairway on a golf course. Maintaining some native vegetation at a height that is safe for motorists can help prevent the introduction and spread of invasives by keeping that nice lush layer of vegetation that does not expose the soil surface. So when out there mowing, keeping a high deck to prevent soil scouring can make a big difference at minimizing the opportunity for invasive species to become established. Knowing what invasive species spread by fragmentation and by seed can help if you're a mower operator. You can avoid those species that spread by fragmentation like knotweed, maybe flag them for follow-up treatment in the future. And knowing a little bit about the biology of certain species and when they're producing their seeds can help us time our mowing regimes so that we're mowing them before they're fully developed with seed, which can actually act as an effective suppression tool, versus mowing them when seeds are present and spreading them down the right of way. And as with all other equipment, cleaning after mowing, particularly before moving between regions, is very important to help limit the spread of seeds and plant fragments. Plant disposal. So we may be out there managing invasive species and we are cutting, pulling, excavating, and we have this plant material that we need to dispose of. The parts of certain invasive species or their seeds in this material, if transported to a disposal site, can begin growing and form new infestations. So it's important to be mindful about how we move and dispose of this material. So what can we do? We want to make sure that this material is rendered non-viable when moving between, moving from site to disposal. And there are a few different techniques that we can use to render material non-viable. This includes things like deep burial. So, digging a pit, depositing our plant parts, our contaminated fill, and then backfilling that. This has been successfully used by some of our DOT partners, like for example, at their Indian Lake residency. For dealing with a small quantity of invasive species, we can just bag that up or create a kind of a little tarp burrito, allow that material to decompose in the sun and then dispose of it in the landfill. When dealing with contaminated fill, it can be stockpiled at a residency or an area where there is low potential for spread and monitored for some time to determine if any plants will emerge from that. And if so, we can treat those species before that fill is used. And an overarching strategy is, of course, covering material while it's in transport. If you're managing invasive plants and need to bring them from site to disposal, we obviously don't want stems flying out of the back of our truck while in transit. And lastly, we'll talk about ditching and excavation. So this can spread invasive species by moving the fragments of roots, of seeds, or other plant parts. The example that you're looking at on this slide is some ditching work that had to go through a infestation of Phragmites, and all of these small white fragments you see on the exposed soil surface. These are Phragmites rhizomes or roots that will eventually form new plants and help this infestation spread. So what can we do with ditching and excavation? Again, consider if this is necessary, much like mowing. If you're maintaining a road corridor and the ditch is 3-4 feet below grade and it is in a nice sandy soil, is significant ditching activity even required at this site? So considering where the practices are deployed. When excavation is required, be mindful of contaminated fill and where it is used or moved. If you are knowingly excavating fill that contains the fragments of an invasive species, only use that fill within the limits of that infestation. Be careful about moving that to other locations where those species could establish and grow. When stockpiling material, for example, during a construction project, this is a great environment for plants to grow in. So monitor those stockpiles to see what's becoming established, especially if that material will be reused in other parts of your project. When transporting ditching or excavated material, cover that, particularly if it is known to contain fragments or seeds of invasive plants. And where ditching or excavation occurs, stabilize those soils as soon as possible using some of the techniques we discussed, such as non-invasive seeding or using straw mulch.
So I would add, thank you, Zach. We can go back to the little hummingbird. Ditching becomes a particularly interesting question because a lot of the invasive species that, do reproduce by plant parts or like thick root material called rhizomes in the Adirondack region do really prefer these abnormally moist habitats, which are perfect for roadsides. And that's why we're ditching, right? Is to make sure water is draining off of a hillside. So being able to just identify if those species are growing there is really key. And one thing I can also mail folks as I'll follow up to this are a few different, real life, not versus a PDF version of a plant guide we have for invasive species for if you have, crews of 5 to 10, I can certainly send you stuff for people to have out in the field as a follow-up to get folks just understanding what's growing out in the environment. So we have 2 really amazing questions that I can see. Yeah, I will send you that field guide. I have a few hundred of them in my car. We have 2 really incredible questions that I want to put out there. One of them is kind of a higher level question from Lynn, and she asked this early in the workshop. So we're going to go to that one second because it's just a higher level question. The first one is a little more direct. It's from Loretta, and she asks, do you have suggestions on how to handle adjacent private property owners that are abundant, where property is abundant with invasives and can be acting as a seed bank for adjacent public land? So I'm going to direct that to Zach and Becca. Feel free.
Sure, I can chime in. This is Zach. So that is a great question. This is something that we face in our own management work as well, where perhaps we have permission to manage parcel A, but adjacent parcel B also has invasive species and is acting as the seed source that is reinvading where we're trying to manage. So when we encounter these situations, we do try to engage private landowners that are adjacent to sites that we're trying to control. So I know that this is a little bit outside the kind of scope of work for a highway department. However, if you're in the Adirondacks or in our PRISM, I would encourage you to reach out to us. There are opportunities where we may be able to assist with landowner outreach, or perhaps if it aligns with our management priorities, perhaps even some direct control. So if you're in the Adirondacks, give us a buzz if you run into these situations, or if you're in another part of New York State, I would suggest reaching out to your local PRISM to see if it's a species that they're interested in assisting with. And I'll ask Becca if she has anything to add.
No, I think that's it. You guys can feel free to, Emily will share my email and phone number with you guys. So if you do ever have that situation, please reach out to me, and I will help in any way I can.
Great. So that actually kind of connects to the next question, but also I want to mention for landowner outreach, pale swallow or the swallow-worts that we just mentioned are absolutely a key species that we have an opportunity right now in the Adirondacks to eradicate. It's of such a small population. Taking a step back, the way that APIPP sets its priorities and looks at different species is a multi-tiered system of having to do with population numbers, the way plants spread on land and in water. And pale swallow-wort happens to be, or multiple swallow-worts happen to be, a species that we have an opportunity to take out. It's in such small numbers that we can go for it. And so we can also send to your crews what we call door hangers. So if they see something out during their day, during their shifts, if they're able to watch this video and then use their plant guide that I can send out, we have materials to just put on a door, on a door handle and say, hey, you have this species, please get in touch with APIPP. So if your crews can also act as the eyes and ears of, helping to prevent the spread of invasive species in the Adirondacks, that's also something that APIPP hopes to work with partners on. So I can feel free to let me know if you would like some of those, or I can just collect addresses in my follow-up email. So going back to that first question, excellent question. So as DOT professionals, our immediate area of influence is limited to the highway corridor and immediate adjacent areas. How can we better coordinate with APIPP, property owners, or others to manage an infestation that spans beyond the highway boundary? I think we addressed some of that with the previous question, but Zach and Becca, feel free, and Tamara is on the line, so feel free, she's our program manager, so feel free to elaborate.
Yeah, I will just expand to say, definitely reach out to us. I don't want to overcommit us and say that, whenever we get an inquiry, it's something that we can assist directly with managing. However, if there are infestations that are identified that overlap with some of our priorities, there are opportunities where we can work collaboratively to manage those. But nonetheless, even if it's not a priority for us, we can often provide technical resources to a landowner that may enable them to address that infestation on their own, or if they're interested, contract with a professional to get that addressed.
This is Tamara, and I just wanted to add that we have about 500 sites that we're managing. Some of them are on public roadways, but we are also working with some private landowners. So for instance, we have several Phragmites project areas in the Adirondacks where we might not try and address Phragmites everywhere, as Emily Bell said. We have limited resources to do that, but we have a few key areas where we think that we can have an impact and avoid some ecological damage. So in those cases, we may be able to work with the private landowners in those Phragmites project areas that we're working on. We also are doing a workshop for landowners in 2 weeks about how to manage knotweed on their own properties. And as Emily Bell said, the swallow-wort species are very important to us. So we may be able to add some management on private lands to those if the highway crews are able to do their part to help us identify where they are and to prevent the spread along highways.
And I'll just add that those door hangers that Emily mentioned not only have some information about the species for landowners, they also have our contact information. So if a landowner were to see that hanging on their door, they would have the information to contact us, and we could help them, either directly if it meets, our requirements, or indirectly, as Zach alluded to, by giving them technical guidance or a list of contractors that they could consult with to remove that species.